For my final project, I chose to do an author study on Jason Reynolds. The first book I chose, we read together, All American Boys, was co-authored with Brandon Keeley. The book also won a Walter Dean Myers Young Adult Literature Award. The second book I chose was on the list for Unexpected Perspectives and is titled Long Way Down, and it's written in verse. It was also a National Book Award finalist. The third and final book I read was When I Was the Greatest by Jason Reynolds. It won the John Steptoe New Talent Coretta Scott King Award, and it was also Jason Reynolds' first novel. I became a fan of Jason Reynolds when I first read All American Boys 2 years ago and immediately decided that I had to have it in my classroom. It was the first book I chose in a series of books that I put into a literature circle unit that focused on issues of social justice. I wanted to give students books that would help them open up these conversations. As an author, all of Jason Reynolds' books do this. If you read the back of his books in the author's note, it always says Jason Reynolds is crazy about stories, but even more so about young people. And I think that's one of the things that connected to me to Jason Reynolds from the very beginning was our passion for young people. In the author's note for Long Way Down, Jason Reynolds writes, or it says, Jason Reynolds is also tired of being around young people who are tired of feeling invisible. So he writes books, a bunch of books, and has even won some awards, but none of them are as important as a young person saying they feel seen. The more that happens, the less tired Jason is. But either way, he's still crazy about stories, about you. To me, this simple little author's note is very moving because as a white woman, I certainly can't relate, but I do understand Jason Reynolds saying that he's tired of living in a world that doesn't let every kid see themselves in the books they're asked to read. And I think he's kind of made it his personal mission to showcase those experiences that are often left out of mainstream literature and are often things we're told we can't talk about in the classroom. And Jason Reynolds approaches them in a way that validate the experiences of those kids, but also allow kids who that experience is dissonant with, allows them to connect and enjoy and relate. And for that reason, I feel like his books go a long way towards fostering empathy. Earlier this summer, Jason Reynolds wrote an article called 10 Things I've Been Meaning to Say to You, and I wanted to share some pieces from that. The first thing he says is that he doesn't believe social media is going to lead to the apocalypse. For me, this is really important because I see my students struggling with the idea that everybody hates their generation. They belong to Generation Z, and I'm a proud millennial, and I can relate to them on that level because for my whole adult life, I've had, baby boomers and people from Gen X complaining about millennials, how we're entitled, how we're spoiled, how we don't know how to be productive members of society. And I see my students catching that even worse. Jason Reynolds takes responsibility for some of the problems that have been created for young people. He says, my generation created social media and we pushed it on you. We gave you this. And now it's here to stay. So what we can do is use it for the good. He says, let me be involved in framing you. Let me help you capture you in your best light. Maybe even tag me in the post. But please, please, please don't force me to photobomb you because I'll do it. And all you'll do is hit delete. So he's being funny here, but Jason Reynolds is saying, social media is this big, complicated thing that we need to figure out how to use, but it's not evil, and you're not bad for using it. The second one is number 2 on the list and is one of the most important things. You can't want to do away with injustice unless you do away with all of it. And this, I think, is such an important conversation for high school students, is introducing them to the idea of intersectionality and what it means to have your different experiences interact with each other to create your unique experience in the world. I have a very explicit conversation with my students about how white feminists can sometimes be irresponsible. And we talk about the pay gap, and we talk about 70 cents on a dollar, 77 cents on a dollar. But what we don't talk about is how much less Mexican women make, and how much less Black women, and people of color in general. When we talk about the wage gap, it's not just about that 77 cent on the dollar that white women make of what white men make. You have to fight everybody's fight if you want it to get better. Jason Reynolds talks about how he wishes that there were safe spaces. He wishes that he could create these for students so that they could learn in a non-judgmental environment, but he embraces the reality that they aren't real. And so what we can do as teachers is try and create that warmth and that comfort and a place for students to grow academically and as people. But what we can't do is protect them from everything. And I think in his novels, we have young boys, young Black men who are dealing with stuff that no one can protect them from. Police brutality, gang violence, guns, fighting. They aren't able to just escape their realities. There are parts of their experience that there are no safe space from. He says, continue to push back, bang your fists, scream until your throats are stripped. Cry out, walk out, march, fight what you don't agree with, even if adults don't agree with you, even if adults call you crybabies, because that kind of emotion, that kind of fearlessness and gumption, that kind of empathetic desire is a seed that will grow you into adults who actually care about the world. This is true social media. So he says, kind of push back against that idea that we're crybabies, that we're always complaining, and that back in the day, they weren't upset about these things and they were tough. He says that fighting back against all this hatred is being tough. And I think his stories give students the courage to stand up. When I read All American Boys with my class, I saw kids who, before they read that book, didn't believe that police brutality was a problem. But they were able to read the perspectives that were shown in the novel, and they were able to realize that this isn't some made-up ploy, that this is a problem in our country that has to be addressed. He encourages kids to go after their dreams, and at the end, he talks about how much he likes young people. And again, I said earlier, that's what I think connected me to Jason Reynolds at first. We both have a passion for showcasing experiences that fall outside of the mainstream. The difference is Jason feels that passion, I can only assume, because he grew up going to school and not seeing any books with kids like him in them. I have that passion because I grew up going to school and all I saw were books with kids like me in them. So I think we meet in the middle of this space where, for one, students whose experiences fall outside of the mainstream need that validation. They need to see how their lives and their culture fit inside the school curriculum. They need to see that what they do in school is relevant to them too. And that means including their experiences and including works by authors who look and sound like them. It means validating their ways of life, their culture, the way that they interact, and their language. I feel that passion for all those reasons, and because students whose experience is the mainstream need to be exposed to ways of knowing and being and seeing the world that are different. I spent the first 20 years of my life thinking things were one way, and I went to college and I learned so many things. And I know that things aren't one way anymore. I know things aren't black and white, not to be punny, but that everything exists on a spectrum rather than a binary. But what I do know is those students whose experiences fall within the mainstream need to see and know and understand that not everybody is like them. And just because they are the majority or the mainstream doesn't mean that their way of life is the right way of life. We can use books like these to teach empathy. And that's a two-way street, because students who read are more empathetic, and students who are more empathetic are better readers. And so we have this cyclical situation where we can use fiction to teach empathy, and we can use empathy to teach fiction. Reynolds also says to be gentle with your teachers. Again, this is one of the things I really appreciate about him as an author. His passion is to get kids reading, and he wants to do that by letting them see themselves in the stories that they read. And he's doing an awesome job at it. So really quickly, I want to book talk some of his books. We read All American Boys together, so I won't do that one. The second one, like I said, was Long Way Down, and it was a National Book Award finalist. It's written in verse. So right here, what happens is a young boy's older brother is shot in the streets, and the younger brother is not involved in any gang violence or anything like that, but he does know the rules around his neighborhood, and that's when someone shoots someone you care about, you don't cry, you don't snitch, and you get revenge. And so the little brother sets out to get revenge on the person who he thinks killed his brother. So he gets his brother's gun, and he gets on the elevator, and he goes down, and as he's going down the flights of the elevator, he's coming into contact with a bunch of important people from his neighborhood that lost their lives to gun violence. And so, like I said, it happens in verse. So it's a really easy read. It might be a really good way to get reluctant readers to commit to a novel, and then maybe you could push them into some of his other texts based on their reaction to it. This book also was a Prince Honor book. The third book I read is When I Was the Greatest. This is about a boy named Alan who goes by Ali, and he lives in Brooklyn, New York with his mom and his sister. And we see how his relationships in his neighborhood and with his best friend Noodles and Noodles' brother Needles, who has Tourette's syndrome, how they kind of go about just being regular boys, but also the experiences that they encounter in their neighborhood, and how they end up somewhere that they really shouldn't have been, and the repercussions of that. So another novel that I read by Jason Reynolds is called The Boy in the Black Suit. It's about a boy who loses a parent. He's a teenager. He's a black boy, and it's really about the grief and how he moves on from that situation. Similar authors, I would compare him to Kekla Magoon, who wrote How It Went Down, which is very similar to All American Boys, but details kind of a situation similar to Trayvon Martin, where the young black boy who's killed is killed by a vigilante. She also wrote The Rock and the River, which is one of my favorite YA books of all time, and also a really good historical fiction read. It follows a young boy whose father is a very prominent member of Martin Luther King's nonviolent movement, and whose older brother is a Black Panther. And so the younger brother is kind of finding his way between those two identities of fighting back and standing up, and kind of the decisions that he makes and what leads him to where he gets. I'm actually starting my instruction on the first day of school this year with my 9th graders, talking about Jason Reynolds and his journey to become an author. I'm going to share with them the 10 things that he wants to share, also as a way to book talk All American Boys, because it will be a literature circle unit. But one of the really awesome things about Jason Reynolds was he was always interested in writing. He was inspired by poetry. He was inspired by rap to start writing poetry, but he didn't read a novel cover to cover until he was 17 years old. And I hear my students saying similar things all the time. What I want them to understand is 17 years old is not too late to pick up a book. But the sooner you do it, and the sooner you power through, the more worlds you can open up. I want to show my students, especially my students of color, that there are kids like them in the books in the library. It's my job as a teacher to show them where to look. So I'm a big Jason Reynolds fan. I hope you guys have enjoyed this. I hope it's been informative. And I hope you pick up some more of his books if you haven't already. Thank you.